When feeding a young, adult performance or an aged horse, it's necessary to adjust the diet to reflect the differences in gastrointestinal tract functionality and the nutrient needs of the horse. Sometimes that's quite a challenge because we tend to use the NRC nutrient requirements of the horse to determine those requirements and really doesn't take into account all the factors that we'd like to take into account when we're talking especially about the performance horse and the aged horse. But we do the best we can with the information we have available. Again, I'm going to show you 10 of the take-home messages for this particular section. And they would be that there are really differences in the gastrointestinal tract physiology and functionality, especially for the young versus the mature horse, as the gastrointestinal tract is still developing, still being colonized by the microbiome, still adjusting to the change in feedstuffs. The tissues have a varying nutrient requirements depending on the age and use of the horse. And there's much we don't know about the nutritional requirements of the horses at the different stages of life. We extrapolate from the information we do have, but there are certainly gaps in our knowledge base, and many of those have to be filled by trial and error on an individual basis. So it's really important that you be observant and flexible, monitor your horse, and make adjustments as needed so that you achieve the growth, development, performance that you want for your horse. The end goal is to find a feed that most closely matches your horse's needs and is compatible with its gastrointestinal tract physiology. Although the focus of this discussion isn't on the nutrient requirements of breeding horses, I need to at least mention that the dam's nutrient requirements has a significant impact on the growth and development of the foal. If the mare does not receive a proper diet, and we're talking about energy and protein, vitamins and minerals, the nutrients that we've been talking about, those key essential nutrients, she will attempt to meet the needs of the foal by catabolizing or breaking down her own tissues to support the growth of the foal. As you can see in the slide, is that the demand of the foal escalates during gestation. At 5.5 months or halfway through gestation, the fetus weighs about 10% of what it will weigh at birth. Another 3 months later, it's close to 50% of its birth weight. Then during the last couple of months, the foal gains another 50% of its birth weight. Consequently, that is when the greatest demands to meet the developing foal's needs are placed on the mother. If the dam just plain doesn't get enough to eat, the foal is born small. That would be obvious indication that things weren't going well. But the dam's diet may be inadequate and the signs may not be immediately obvious. For example, an important nutrient in bone development is copper. While there is copper in mare's milk, it is not present in high enough quantities to meet the foal's needs while it is nursing. Instead, the foal must rely on the copper that has been stored in its own body, the liver primarily, the copper that accumulates in utero, and when and if the mare was fed the extra copper that she needs during pregnancy. If the mare doesn't receive adequate copper in her diet during gestation, the foal's body stores when it is born are reduced. In an effort to remedy the situation, you might think it would be reasonable to feed extra copper to the newborn foal. However, studies have shown that at that point in its life, the foal isn't able to absorb copper from other feedstuffs as well. Providing supplemental copper doesn't fix the problem. Excuse me. Instead, the foal needs to rely on its body's stores, mobilizing copper from its liver. The amount of copper in the foal's liver is only adequate if the mare received enough copper while she was pregnant. During the first few months of the foal's life, its growth relies primarily on the nutrients it receives in its mother's milk. Here you can see from this chart that the amount of weight the foal must drink in order to gain the pound of weight at different ages increases over time. So at 7 days of age, it has to consume 9 pounds of milk to put on a pound of weight. However, at 1 month, it needs to consume 13 pounds of milk for every pound of gain. And at 2 months, it has to drink 15 pounds of milk for every 1 pound of gain. That makes sense if you consider that the nutrients are used first to maintain the existing tissue. So as the animal grows, more and more of what it eats is taken to maintain its body weight, and only what is left over can be used for actual growth or increasing its weight. Milk production is greatest during early lactation, when the foal is relying most heavily on the mare's milk for its nutrients, compared to later in lactation, when the foal begins to consume more and more other feedstuffs and can make use of those feedstuffs. So what are those other feedstuffs and just how well are they used? During the first 24 hours postpartum, when the foal nurses, it's drinking colostrum, which is a critical source of antibodies, along with other nutrients important in the development of the immune system. There are specialized cells in the small intestine which are able to engulf those droplets of colostrum, transporting them across the gastrointestinal tract wall into the body proper without having the antibodies being degraded. It's a unique situation. It occurs for up to about 24 hours, although most of it happens during actually the first 6 to 8 hours. Why it's so very important that the newborn foal actually nurses. After colostrum, the mare produces milk. Milk is an important source of nutrients, especially during the first 2 months while the foal's gastrointestinal tract is growing and developing. Initially, the gastrointestinal tract of the foal has a disproportionately large foregut and a small hindgut compared to, say, a mature horse. As the foal grows, the rate of growth in the hindgut exceeds the rate of growth in the foregut until reaching the relative proportions that you see in a mature horse's gastrointestinal tract, where the hindgut is so much larger. The foregut of the foal is able to digest and absorb the nutrients in colostrum and milk. Within 10 to 14 days, the foal's foregut is able to digest and absorb nutrients in cereal grains. However, it isn't until 6 to 8 weeks of age that the foal can make full use of forages. Keep in mind that when a foal is born, it doesn't have the microbial population that it needs to ferment the nutrients in the forages. Those have to be acquired, and then the hindgut has to become colonized with those microbes. So even though the foal is eating some pasture or chewing hay, its ability to make use of the nutrients in those feedstuffs is very limited. As the foal is able to use forages, its reliance on its mother's milk starts to wane. Using the information in the 2007 National Research Council nutrient requirement for horses, if you take a 6-month-old weanling and compare it to an adult horse, it needs roughly twice the calorie level per kilogram of body weight as that adult horse. It needs this every day, but it also needs 2.5 times more protein, 4.5 times more minerals. So if you're feeding your weanling the same diet as your adult horse, or just hoping it will eat enough if given free choice access to hay to cover nutrition, it will not get what it needs. Neither will a yearling and neither will a young horse, which is still growing. That is, unless you have an adequate understanding of the average profile of the forage and aim to fill in the deficiency gaps for more than just calories. While the concentration of some key nutrients have been established for young horses, others have not been. That makes filling in the missing gaps that are left in the ration a challenge, to say the very least. Concentrates, made up ideally from a pelleted or extruded feedstuff to facilitate digestion, should be offered 2 to 3 times a day at about 0.5 to 1% of the horse's body weight for the entire day. So let's say your foal weighs, 250 pounds at 2 months of age. So you would offer it 1.25 pounds of concentrate formulated for foals at a meal every time. And that meal would be repeated anywhere from 2 to 4 times spread out over the day. We want to make sure the mare cannot get to the foal's feed. She may love him, but she'll still eat his food. The goal is to maintain a steady growth and good body condition score. Salt and water should always be available, as you know. The foal should not have free choice access to the concentrate in order to avoid overeating, and the foal should not have access to the mare's ration if it's different than its own, because that would unbalance its ration. And even if the ration is the same, the amount it is eating would be impossible to determine. Nutrient density of the feedstuff decreases as the foal, weanling, and yearling grows because it can eat more. Growth of the skeleton or the frame size determines how tall the horse will be. which is of particular interest to the horse owner. When choosing a feeding regime, the goal is to balance the size and quality of the skeletal structure. Bones have priority over muscles for the available nutrients during the early stages of growth, which means in general that the horse is growing taller and longer faster than its muscle mass is accumulating. Kind of that tall, gangly look in the young growing horse. You can see in this chart that a weanling at 6 months of age has already achieved 84% of its mature height, while it has only achieved 46% of its mature weight. Importantly, although the bones are elongating, so the horse is getting taller and longer, their mineral content is not deposited as quickly and is only at 68.5% of the bone mineral density at maturity. So elongation exceeds density. At 12 months, the horse has achieved 94% of its height, and it isn't until 60 months, 5 years of age, that elongation of the bones contributing to height has stopped or closed, and the horse's body weight has caught up with the growth of the bone. While the bone may not be able to get longer, it can still become thicker and denser. Another concept to keep in mind is that the growth of the skeleton is asymmetrical. Some parts of the skeleton are growing longer earlier and then cease to grow sooner than others. We can see that as waves of growth. You know, when you look at a foal, a young foal, that it doesn't have the same body proportions as an adult horse would have. Its head and legs are proportionally larger than its torso. That's because the waves of bone growth start at the head and move toward the butt, while another wave of growth starts at the butt and moves toward the head. Those waves of bone growth move from hoof, or the distal portion of the body, towards the torso, or proximal part of the body. When all is said and done, the last portion of the skeleton to mature is a region at the base of the neck. Ensuring the quality of the growth and development of the growing horse's bone structure is of keen interest. Genetics, exercise, nutrition can all play a role in the occurrence of abnormalities in the growth of the skeleton and the soft connective tissue associated with it, or developmental orthopedic disorders, also known as DODs. The term developmental orthopedic disorders encompasses a number of different types of abnormalities. Horses selected for and fed for rapid growth are at increased risk of developmental orthopedic disorders, but growth rate alone does not cause the problem. Overfeeding energy by, say, 30% or more above the recommended level, cited in the NRC, increases the risk of developmental orthopedic disorders. So deciding that to feed in excess energy in order to optimize or maximize growth really doesn't optimize growth. Instead, it maximizes growth but increases the risk for developmental orthopedic disorders, especially if the mineral intake is not increased at the same time. Another situation is in which we see an increase in developmental orthopedic disorders occurs when a period of slow growth are followed by periods of rapid growth. Think buying a small, for its age, weanling or yearling at an auction with the intent of taking it home and feeding it up. You see in this scheme where the size, think of height or weight here, versus time here. If the horse or any animal isn't fed an adequate diet, which can be simply that it didn't get enough, or it could be a diet that doesn't match its needs, the requirements aren't met, then growth becomes stymied or becomes restricted. It could be, as in this case, growth is completely stopped. There's no increase in size. That's pretty extreme. It could as easily be that growth is slowed significantly. So you see in this weanling at the auction that you might think it's small for its age, and you buy it. You whisk it home, have it checked by the vet, and then start feeding it the ration it should have always had. It will start to grow again, and depending on how long it's been deprived and to what extent and when it was deprived, it might actually grow faster than it would have if it had been received a proper diet all along. So you have this period of accelerated growth where this line is a steeper slope than if it had been fed a normal diet the whole time that you see here. Or it might grow at the same rate that it would have had otherwise. So that would be a case where you have parallel growth. So these two lines are parallel. Oops, excuse me, didn't draw that very well. Parallel. And so it will achieve the same size, but it'll simply take longer. Or, and I'm afraid this happens much too often, it might not be able to ever achieve the size it had a genetic potential to be. During the recovery period, the risk for developmental orthopedic diseases increases. So you have a period of reduced or retarded growth. It's at a less steep slope than it would have had under normal circumstances, and it never actually reaches the size it could have been if it had been fed properly all along. In addition to periods of slow growth, followed by periods of rapid growth, mineral deficiencies, mineral imbalances are then well documented to increase the likelihood of developmental orthopedic disorders. Decades ago, excessive protein was blamed as a cause for developmental orthopedic disorders, but later studies have disproved that connection. Restricting protein will not result in improved bone growth and may actually be harmful to the animal. For example, trauma due to excessive concussions may increase the incidence of developmental orthopedic disorders. However, restricting exercise also unfavorably affects bone growth and development. Turning the foals out for as long as possible is highly recommended. Strenuous forced exercise should be avoided. When feeding the adult horse, they should be fed for minimal or moderate work if they are actually in maintenance. A forage-based diet where forage provides a quality forage where nutrient concentration is adequate and anti-nutritive components are minimized, no dust, no mold, no insects, no trash, etc. A horse should receive a ration balancer to provide trace minerals that are required and fat-soluble vitamins, especially if they are in this situation. You see these horses are in a confinement setting where they're not allowed to graze fresh vegetation. They should always receive free choice access to salt, loose salt preferably, and always unlimited access to clean temperate water. Exercise is, so we talked about the horse kind of maintenance, it probably isn't doing too much, but exercise is a different situation. It's metabolically specific, anaerobic or aerobic. Short bursts of high intensity exercise or very prolonged periods of exercise, or in the worst case scenario, when a horse is fatigued, the horse's muscles rely on anaerobic metabolism when oxygen availability is limited. The horse's muscles rely on energy substrates actually stored in the muscle, such as glycogen, although maximal exercise is limited not by the depletion of glycogen stores, but instead by a buildup of lactic acid, a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. Lactic acid accumulation decreases the muscle pH, which limits the use of glycogen stores still present in the muscle. Examples of anaerobic exercise would be the traditional horse race, over and done with in seconds or minutes, calf roping, barrel racing, you get the idea. Sudden, fast, powerful explosions of action. In contrast, when the exercise is of long duration and low intensity, oxygen is available for muscle use. Glucose from the muscle glycogen stores or from the blood, and similarly fatty acids released from fat depots in the muscle itself, as well as from adipose tissue, are the primary energy substrates used by the skeletal muscle. Fatigue happens when some combination of muscle glycogen concentrations become depleted, muscle temperature increases, electrolyte concentrations are altered, or the signal from the neurons for the muscles to contract actually become fatigued. The quintessential example of aerobic exercise would be an endurance ride. If you take it a step farther, you have the endurance race. Although at the higher levels of competition, it seems like the endurance race is almost an extended sprint. Probably more common would be a long trail ride. While I focused on the anaerobic and aerobic type activities, in reality, there's much in between, even at the competitive level. Think polo pony. What are the characteristics of an athletic horse? It needs to have the muscle mass as well as the skeletal structure to withstand the rigors of exercise. So an ideal lean body mass. It mustn't be too thin nor too fat, since either will compromise the ability to perform. It needs to have the energy resources and the means to use them in order to power through its workload. A horse with a very heavy workload has over twice the requirement for energy and protein than that of a similar horse at maintenance. So we know we need to provide more calories and more protein. It's relatively easy to tell if your horse needs more energy. Is he fat or thin or just right. The optimal body condition score is highly correlated with performance, and the optimal body weight of, say, a racehorse has a range of only plus or minus 1.5%, with performance appearing to be less affected by being overweight as compared to being underweight. However, it is important to maximize lean body mass, that is bone and muscle, while minimizing excessive body fat, rather than just restricting calorie intake to achieve the desired body condition score. You want a lean horse with sufficient bone and muscle to do the job, and you can't manage that by manipulating nutrition alone. It requires the appropriate exercise as well. For a horse that has a very heavy workload, you'll want to feed energy and protein-dense forages. Think legumes rather than grasses for racehorses, and tend toward grass hay in combination with one or more of the super fibers for endurance horses. If your horse can't or won't eat enough forage or forage alternatives to meet its needs, you could add concentrates, which have had fat added to them. The benefit to supplemental fat is that it stimulates the activity of the enzymes in the muscle that result in increased uptake and oxidation of free fatty acids that are used during aerobic exercise, thereby sparing glycogen. If the diet is low in protein, choose a concentrate that contains the supplemental rate-limiting amino acids lysine, threonine, and methionine. Keep in mind that you need to be ever vigilant in monitoring your horse's body condition score. Is he fat or thin? In many instances, a body condition score of 4.5, 4 to 4.5 to 5, with probably 4 to 4.5 frequently observed in top contenders of endurance races, and a body condition score of 5 for traditional horse races. We discussed the importance of muscle glycogen for aerobic exercise, what works with humans, consuming a starch-rich meal preceding an expected aerobic event to stockpile your muscle glycogen. Hasn't been consistently successful work with horses, unless the level of starch supplementation exceeds that which is compatible with the horse's gastrointestinal tract. It's not like you can have that spaghetti dinner before you do your long-distance swim, carbohydrate loading. As a human being, it doesn't really work in the case of horses. Glycogen storage does not appear to increase with body condition score once over a certain level in the horse. While it's fairly easy to determine body condition score, to determine your horse's lean body mass, bone and muscle, is difficult. Lean body mass may only be apparent by how well the horse performs. As an exercise program progresses, bone density and muscle mass will increase and the performance will improve. Protein in the diet of the athlete is needed to maintain current body tissues, repair and replace both skeletal muscle and bone tissue that needs due to exercise, as well as to support additional bone and muscle growth. Increased requirements of protein can sometimes be met by simply feeding more of the same diet, or by switching to a more protein-dense diet, say switching from grass hay to a legume hay. However, the horse also has needs of an increase in energy as well. If the horse owner supplements their horse's diet with oil rather than feeding more hay or more protein-dense hay, the horse's elevated protein requirements may not be met. Exercising horses can be fed lower concentrations of crude protein if their diets are fortified with limiting amino acids. So you can make up that difference in protein quality. Just how much additional protein is needed by the performance horse has not been unequivocally established. The tendency then is to feed an excess of dietary protein. There's research which has shown that an excess of dietary protein could be a bad idea because of the increased heat production and a possible disruption of the acid-base balance, especially at maximal exercise. There's also research that has shown that a 30% increase in crude protein above the recommendation made by the NRC for racehorses in training had a sparing effect on glycogen stores in skeletal muscle. Additionally, there is some evidence that substantial amounts of nitrogen, a component of protein, may be lost through sweat, and so needs to be replaced in horses that sweat a lot, so your athletic horse. In essence, the skeleton tries to achieve a balance between bone that is strong enough while maintaining an energetically efficient skeleton without storing an excess amount of mineral. When stress and strain is applied to a horse's bones, they respond by rearranging the interior architecture of those bones to be able to better withstand that stress and strain. The reconfiguration process requires additional calcium and phosphorus. To ensure that your horse is receiving the calcium and phosphorus it needs, add up all the sources of calcium and phosphorus from forages, concentrates, supplements, etc., in order to calculate the absolute amount of each and the ratio of calcium to phosphorus. If either the absolute amounts or the ratios are unacceptable, adjust the diet accordingly. Hard-working horses that sweat have a substantial increased requirement for the electrolytes sodium, chloride, and potassium because they are lost in the sweat, especially when the ambient temperature and humidity are high. Horse sweat glands are different from human sweat glands, with the result that horses lose more electrolytes during sweating per volume of fluid than, say, humans do. Water losses can be quite high during exercise, up to 10 to 15 liters an hour. The rate of water loss will depend on the intensity of the exercise, as well as the ambient temperature and humidity, and is also a result of the level of the horse's fitness. We know that early in the dehydration, the horse can cope well with fluid loss, and that certain breeds of horses can sustain water loss better than others. You can see in the image in the upper right corner of this slide the tucked up appearance of the abdomen. You see here of an endurance horse that successfully completed an 80-kilometer run of endurance exercise over 3 consecutive days. The solution to maintaining electrolyte status is to have the horse in good electrolyte balance before the exercise, and then to supply it with an electrolyte-rich ration after its exercise. Typically, a good quality forage, loose salt, and a concentrate is also found. It should contain 1% sodium chloride to be adequate. An electrolyte-rich diet is probably good enough for anaerobic exercise because of the high-intensity exercises for relatively short periods of time. But it could be a different situation for the aerobic exercise. Despite the lack of data, supplementation of endurance horses with oral electrolyte slurries before, during, and after competition is a widely practiced activity, and there's evidence to support this practice could enhance recovery. The question is largely whether or not supplemental electrolyte administration would increase voluntary water intake by exercising horses. Research has shown that the horses will drink more water after a strenuous exercise, during which they sweated a lot, if they received an oral drench of electrolytes. It stimulates the drinking response. In a follow-up study where horses were given an initial drink of salt water, either isotonic, similar to the ion concentration is in the general circulation, or hypotonic, so less concentrated than you find in the general circulation, or even plain water for 5 minutes immediately after exercise. Then their water intake for the next hour was monitored. Horses given salt water initially drank more during the next hour. They also preferred water that was about 68 degrees Fahrenheit rather than water that was either 50 degrees or 86 degrees. So there's a kind of a sweet spot in terms of what optimizes voluntary water consumption, which is a key in some of these horses that have lost a lot of weight in water and ions through sweating. For the endurance horse in particular, superfibers have been shown to increase water retention in the hindgut, and there's evidence that differences in dietary fiber type may have influenced core temperature during endurance type exercise. However, the benefits must be weighed against the extra weight that the horse has to carry. As always, appropriate vitamin and mineral supplementation should be maintained. We'll switch gears now and focus on the aged horse. You'll find that there is no consensus on when a horse actually becomes aged. Some of us think of it in terms of chronological age, where a horse that is 20 years old is considered aged by many. Horses of other ages may exhibit what we think of as age-related physiological changes, changes such as chronically low body condition score, loss of muscle mass, uneven teeth wear, or even teeth loss, as well as an increased susceptibility to environmental effects. Maybe they seem to be chilled easier than when they were younger, and they are also more likely to be electrolyte depleted. The decrease in how well the horse functions relative to a younger horse, or even a more telling relative to how themselves function when they were younger, can occur well before they reach 20 for some horses, while in other instances, not until they're in the 30s. Aged horses have difficulty maintaining a proper body condition score and lean body mass. Probably most noticeable along the horse's top line. The inability to maintain weight may not be so much that the aged horse needs more energy and protein, but it may be that it doesn't eat as much as it used to. A horse that is arthritic or has had an injury may find movement difficult or painful, and so is less likely to move from feeding station to feeding station in the pasture to graze. It may even have limitations in its ability to lower its head in order to graze. It may also be less likely to travel the necessary distance to get water. Sometimes an aged horse is less aggressive or slips farther down the pecking order in a herd setting, which makes competing for feed more difficult and perhaps more effort than it's even worth. A solution to these difficulties could be to limit the distance the horse has to move in order to get its feed and/or feed it individually. Decreased digestibility is believed to contribute to the aged horse with chronically low body condition score and loss of muscle mass. Studies have been conducted to determine if the requirement for protein is greater in the aged horse than a younger but mature horse. The results suggest that whether the horse needs more protein in its diet may be a factor of how it was cared for in its past. If the horse had had an inadequate health program or is currently suffering from health problems, its protein requirements could be higher than for a horse that had not been subjected to those types of stresses. However, if the horse had been well cared for throughout its life, then evidence shows or suggests that there is no difference in protein digestibility between the aged and the mature horse. Of course, having sufficient essential amino acids in the diet is important, and as a result, it's not uncommon for synthetic sources of the first 3 rate-limiting amino acids to be incorporated into the commercial senior diets. There is research that suggests that the horse greater than 20 have about a 5% reduction in forage digestibility compared to, say, a 2 or 3-year-old horse. That appears to be in addition to the impact that the horse may have teeth which have worn unevenly or may be missing. After the equine dentist has done what he or she can do to correct that situation, the solution may be to allow the horse to graze on pasture, assuming mobility isn't a constraint. Fresh vegetative pasture is easier to chew and easier to digest. Alternatively, a variation on traditional hay could be offering horse chopped hay cubes or hay pellets, where a lot of the hay has been reduced in particle size before the horse actually gets it. You could also substitute some portion of the hay with superfibers, which are more readily digestible. Take less chewing as a rule. If chewing is a problem, you could choose a complete or senior diet that has been pelleted or extruded, which improves digestibility, and/or you could add water and make the feed into a mash, which minimizes the need for chewing. If, despite your best efforts, the horse is unable to maintain its weight and has a body condition score of 3 or less, its ability to maintain its body temperature is significantly impaired, which in turn increases the need for more dietary energy on top of the increase in dietary energy requirement imposed by the cold temperatures. A horse with a low body condition score should be protected from the cold and wet. That protection may be in the form of a blanket or in the picture you see here, sweaters, if the body condition score is 3 or less. The horse should also have access to shelter where it can get out of the wind and the wet. What constitutes cold for some horses is not cold for others. It depends partially on whether they have been exposed to gradually decreasing daylight hours, decreasing ambient temperature, which stimulates hair coat growth. We know that some horses in the same setting will develop long, thick, even fluffy hair coats, while others have hair coats that are shorter and sleeker, although hopefully sufficiently thick enough. Aerobic capacity of older exercising horse is less than that of younger horses. Older horses work harder than younger horses at a given speed and effort. Consequently, they may sweat more than a younger horse at the same intensity of exercise. It's more likely that the aged exercising horse will need electrolyte supplementation when working at a relatively low intensity. Excuse me. Of particular interest in the nutritional regime of the aged horse is the amount of calcium and phosphorus in the diet. Although there isn't a lot of research, it appears that phosphorus digestibility decreases in the aged horse, so it's important to ensure that the absolute amount of calcium and phosphorus, as well as the calcium to phosphorus ratio, is appropriate. That brings us once again to the take-home messages for this section. All horses should have free choice access to clean temperate water, salt, provided ad libitum, and should receive supplemental trace mineral and fat-soluble vitamins. Nursing foals, 6 to 8 weeks of age, should be fed a concentrate designed for foals at the rate of about 0.5% to 1% of their body weight, divided into multiple meals to maintain good body condition score while avoiding obesity. Free choice, high quality, readily digestible forages at that age would be also very appropriate. Weanling and yearlings should be fed concentrates designed for growing horses at the rate of 1 to 1.2% of its body weight, divided into 3 meals to maintain good body condition score and again avoid obesity. While adult horses at maintenance should be fed free choice for forage while maintaining good body condition score. When feeding the performance and aged horse, they should again have access to clean temperate water and salt, should receive supplemental trace minerals and fat soluble vitamins. So that's a recurring theme regardless of age, condition, or anything else. Those are key requirements that need to be met at all times, in all situations. The intensely exercised horse should be fed a high quality forage free choice and supplemented with superfibers, fats, and concentrated as needed to maintain good body condition scores. So probably in that order, high quality forage. If the horse has trouble meeting its energy needs, you want to have immature legume hay. And then if necessary, you would supplement with superfibers that have readily digestible, fermentable fibers. You would want then to add some fat to the ration, especially in a hard-working horse. Fats are readily digestible, doesn't disrupt the rest of the balance, but it provides the calories. And then if you need to, you provide concentrates to address any gaps that might still exist in terms of energy requirements. An intensely exercised horse should be given electrolytes to replace those lost in sweat and to always encourage drinking. Maximizing water consumption should be always a goal in your intensely exercised horse. Your aged horse may need to be fed a ration that's easier to chew. And it might be because their teeth aren't as good a shape, or it might be just that they need more time. And so anything that's easier to chew allows them to accomplish the same thing in a shorter period of time. They should be fed a ration that is more digestible. So it might be a pelleted or an extruded product, especially if their teeth are not of the best quality. And they probably require additional phosphorus, since phosphorus absorption is less in the aged horse. Fed separately and given additional protection from the inclement weather may be appropriate if they have lost some of the hierarchy in a group setting, if they have trouble keeping sufficient weight on to allow them to maintain body temperature. They need to be put in a situation where they have more time and more protection otherwise to do well. That brings us back to the take-home messages that we discussed at the very beginning of this discussion. When you're feeding a young horse, an adult at maintenance, a performance horse, heavily exercising, or an aged horse, the take-home messages have a lot of similarities. They recognize that there are some differences in the gastrointestinal physiology or functionality for the young versus the mature horse, and take that into account when balancing its ration. Tissues and systems have varying nutrient requirements depending upon the age and the use of the horse. So again, you would calculate that, take that into account when you're calculating ration. And there's a recognition that there's much we don't know about the nutritional requirements of the horses at the different stages of life and at different levels of work. So we need to be observant and flexible and be willing to make note of the effects of what we're doing and make adjustments as needed. The goal of providing a feed that most closely matches the horse's requirements or needs in as best as we can determine and is compatible with its gastrointestinal tract physiology.